All right, okay. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk to you today about culture, but I want to start, which seems oddly irrelevant to design, I know, and stuff that we're doing day to day, but I assure you it'll become relevant. So I'm Ben. I'm a senior UX designer at ClearLeft, although funnily enough, I don't do a lot of UX anymore. I do a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to start with something from David Foster Wallace. I don't know if you guys have read him, but he gave this commencement speech. And he said, there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way. And the older fish nods at them and says, morning, boys, how's the water? The two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them goes over to the other and says, what the hell is water? He goes on, the capital T truth is about life before death. It is about the real value of a real education, which has nothing to do with knowledge and everything to do with simple awareness. Awareness of what is so real and essential, so hidden in plain sight all around us all the time, that we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over, this is water, this is water. It is unimaginably hard to do this, to stay conscious and alive in the adult world day in and day out. This is what I want to talk to you about today. Because, as the title of my talk suggests, culture is your operating system. Now, Terence McKenna, he kind of meant it in a slightly different sense. He kind of meant, well, to rid yourself of the trappings of your culture that you grew up with, take a large amount of psychedelic drugs, and your third eye will open. But his point stands, right, is that we're in a culture that we rarely see and that we rarely deal with. We don't talk about it. We don't see it as a problem half the time. So why are we here? Why are we here in tech? What are we doing collectively, if we were to sum it up? Ever thought about it? Or is it just something you wandered into like I did? Okay, well, in the beginning, there was a computer. And institutions began calculating and storing them. But they brought with them the conventions of yesteryear. Files, folders, documents, mail, and still enormous amounts of ink and paper, right? We're just talking about the trappings of those metaphors. I'd say only very recently are we starting to overcome some of those metaphors. Only very recently. A product like Slack is an example of that. And the real computing revolution is here, right? We thought it was desktop computers. No, we were wrong. It isn't, because we had to choose to go to those. We don't choose to stay with our mobile devices. It's a completely different kettle of fish. It's a whole new world, having a device with you all the time. This is our new reality. And the question is, are we ready to create services for this new reality? Mostly not, because we made software in the past using industrial era thinking and process. That's what we understood. That's all the baggage that we brought with us, right? So the problem is all the successful consumer services we use in our pockets, they weren't built the industrial top-down way, as we all know, right? Now, I'm going to guess that every single one of you is in an incumbent organization that existed before the digital era. Are there any exceptions to that right now? Just let me know. Okay. Venkatesh Rao. He's one of my favorite Silicon Valley thinkers. He said this: we are only just beginning to understand how software is now the core function of every company, no matter what it makes or what service it actually provides. I would imagine there are if we could put a percentage on it, how many organizations don't really understand this yet? Most of them. And there's a lot of talk about digital transformation, but what I think is when people say digital transformation to be ready for this new era, what they really mean is changing the culture of the institution. Because it can't cope. It doesn't know how. At ClearLeft, these are our clients, over the past 2 or 3 years, as I said, increasingly we're less doing design and more thinking, well, how the hell do you change an institution so that it becomes digitally savvy, so that it produces great digital services? I like what Kim Goodwin says to answer this question, what are we all here for? Our true goal is culture that makes bad UX unthinkable. It's not the whole story, but it's a really good summary, right? If we think about what we're doing collectively, right? Your stakeholders, your sysadmins, your software developers, your designers, your content people, everybody in harmony is trying to produce an experience for a user. So although I would say that, right, I'm a UX person, I don't think it's mine alone, right? If the servers aren't working, we're screwed, right? We all need to work to these things together. This is our collective goal. Because culture eats strategy for breakfast. The tactical stuff, there's the bottom layer. Then there's the decision-making, the strategy. And above that is the culture. This is the real stuff, the stuff that we're not seeing, that we don't look at. So what can we learn from our history as an industry? So Brian Chesky, the founder of Airbnb, he asked his principal investor, I think Series A, after he'd just been handed $150 million, he said to Peter Thiel, "What is the most important piece of advice you can give me right now as the founder of a company that's about to experience exponential growth, hopefully?" Do you know what he said? Does anybody know this? Because that's the big risk, right? It's easy with 5 people in a room to keep that culture intact. Hundreds? Thousands? No. We've all seen this happen in various ways, right? You guys are coming at it from the other way, creating a useful digital culture within an incumbent organization. I went to a talk a little while ago from the project manager of the first iPhone, Tyler Mincy, and he said, Apple has a culture of respectful challenge. It's a nice summary. That he uses phrase like, not, I think this is wrong, but help me understand what you've designed here. Now, I know the stories about Jobs, right? We know that it was not all respectful, I know. But, right, he's saying that actually, at their level, they were able, their teams felt safe to challenge each other in respectful ways. Jared Spool at UIE, he did some research on the most functioning, the most successful teams. And these were the 3 things they noticed. They discarded a lot of stuff, but these are the 3 things they noticed. Number 1, everyone in these small teams can repeat the vision using almost exactly the same words. How many of you know exactly where your institution wants to be in 5 years' time in a digital space and can say it to me right now in a way that your colleagues will say it? Not many, right? This is what it takes to be an awesome team. Here's a second one, and I'm going to talk about this one later in my research talk. Everyone spends, on average, 2 hours in 6 weeks watching users either use their own product or a competitor's. Is everyone doing that? I hope so. Couple of nods. Yeah. Everyone? Developers too. They have to empathize too, right? Third thing they found. There's something about these teams, there's something alternative about them. Not necessarily uniform, but certainly something you wouldn't expect. Like having parties when they fail, because they learn something. Very strange. And on that last point, Ed Catmull. This is my favorite book, by the way. I'm not making this up. This is absolutely my favorite book I have ever read, Creativity, Inc., by the founder of Pixar. Go read it. It's amazing. If you aren't experiencing failure, then you are making a far worse mistake. You are being driven by the desire to avoid it. How many times have we all dealt with institutions trying so hard to run away from this stuff? So how do we go about changing it? I mean, this is an enormous topic. I'm just giving you kind of a taster of a few things that I've been thinking about and that I've been working on. How about this? I'm currently working with the largest IT organization in India. 400,000 developers, almost no designers. They want to be design-centric. Some teams are literally 3,000 engineers. I'm just starting to think about how I change that culture, just starting now. Venkatesh Rao, I come back to him a lot. He said this, he did a quick survey about this to see who was paying attention to what he's been writing, mostly. So an institution is best defined and understood as a set of habits. That's exactly what he was thinking. And his Twitter followers clearly agree with him. It's kind of weird, right? Like, what do we mean by a set of habits? The way I've sort of come to think about a lot of institutions is that they're basically smokers, right? They're deeply ingrained in these cycles. And they have their habits, right? Steering groups. Who's got rid of their steering groups yet? No hands. Everybody have steering groups? Okay, ditch them, fast as you can. Sign off, oversight, these habits, these cycles, all the time going on. Silicon Valley doesn't do any of that stuff. We need to get rid of that stuff. So let's talk about the habit cycle. I mean, in academia, it's cue, routine, reward, okay? Well, I'm going to be slightly facetious here anyway. How often do you see this? A stakeholder has an idea, that turns into a project, and they get promoted, right? That's the habit. There it is. It's not, for example, working lean, which is build, measure, learn. I should have put that one up as well. That's the ideal cycle at the moment that I can see. Build, measure, learn, build, measure, learn. The Japanese practice of working Kaizen, that's how Toyota made their cars really reliable. Continual improvement, not this big thinking up front. And I should say, I'm constantly hired to do big thinking up front, not actually continually work on something. But it's bloody hard to change culture. Stuart Brand talked about this, right? He had this concept of pace layering. And it's the second slowest thing that changes our culture. It's enormously hard to break habits, as we all know, right? I struggle with my habits every day. And institutions, I mean, that's just me, but when you're dealing with all these external complex factors at once. So I want to talk about a handful. Again, these are just tidbits, right? I'm not giving you the big picture of how to change culture. I'm just going to give you some avenues to start thinking about. So the first one is Dave Gray's culture map. Dave's a friend of ClearLeft's. We've had him speak a few times. And what his kind of interest in is what's underneath the iceberg? What is not spoken about? Right? So here you can see levers stated. This is things like your stated values. Who's got a values section on their website? No? Or strategy or something along those lines, right? The thing that says this is what the institution stands for. Enron's was like trust, respect, compassion, something like that. I'm making it up, right? But it was that bad, right? Enron's had no respect for the people they were dealing with. And Dave's point here is that actually, below the stated things are a whole layer of unstated things that when you first join an institution, you don't know. And then within those first few months, right, you become subsumed by them and you start to internalize them too in the way people speak. But the culture map itself is a useful way to start thinking about and uncovering what your organization's culture is. What are the unstated things? What are the things that are stopping you from experiencing failure safely? So coming back to some of the academic thinkers, sorry, I didn't write down the names of who came up with this model, but there are essentially 4 types of culture. Okay, so clans, they are family-like. They are focused on mentoring, nurturing, doing things together. So academia, councils, they're a fairly good match for clans. Adhocracy-oriented cultures, they're dynamic, they're entrepreneurial, they focus on risk-taking, innovation, and doing things first. Tend to be smaller. I work in an adhocracy. Some of the people I work with hate process. They will absolutely run away from it, sometimes to their detriment, but you take my point, right? I'm free to kind of make up as I go along. Market-oriented cultures, they're results. You talk about numbers. That's the thing you're evaluated on. There's a focus on competition, achievement, getting the job done. And hierarchies. Hierarchy-oriented cultures, structured and controlled, a focus on efficiency, stability, doing things the right way. Top-down, broken, inappropriate, mostly, for the digital world. So, and institutions, I should say, are not exclusively one or the other. What you tend to see, I think in most of your fields, is a mixture of clan and hierarchy. You know, clans tend to run towards safety. Let's get as many people into the room so we can feel as safe about making this decision as possible. Yeah, I'm seeing some nods, yeah. So have a think about this model. Where do you fit into it, right? Because interestingly, you're over this side, but in the academic research, these institutions are externally focused and differentiated, right? So if we're talking about being service-driven or focused on what's going on in the outside world, you need to be more over this side. I'm not saying be one of these institutions, but you see, clans and hierarchies tend to be looking inward. This is a deep problem. If you start reading about this, Kim Goodwin, who I mentioned before, has a lot of advice about how to deal with design and tech in these within these types of institution, which I'd highly recommend, including the counterintuitive tip of bring more people into the room in clans, which I always don't understand, but does kind of work. I do a lot of work with institutions where all I'm doing is just listening to large groups of people, not because I need to hear what they're saying, but because that's what makes them feel safe about what I'm doing later or what I'm recommending later on. There's a clan tactic for you. So mind your Britishness. I've always felt a bit outside of this. My dad's Dutch, and my mum's from somewhere else. She's, and it's. My Englishness has always felt a little bit, my home life has always been kind of different, right? And the thing about Brits is the desperate avoidance of conflict. The moment you must catch yourself out is when you desperately don't want to talk about something, or you start using these around the house, these ways of talking about a thing. This is the culture we must start taking apart, to have real, honest conversations. So, things like this. What we say, that's a very brave proposal. What we mean, you are insane. What others understand, foreigners, I think he has courage. It's just, really bizarre. But start unpicking. Geert Hofstede has this way of measuring culture. So Brits, we have what's called low power distance. So we're allowed to speak to our superiors, but we tend to avoid conflict. There's other cultures, like in France, everyone's quiet around their superiors. And I'm dealing with this in India right now, right? As soon as a leader walks into the room, silence. How do you deal with that? It's really, really hard. How do I get the ideas out of the designer in the corner who's been culturally conditioned not to say anything or never challenge? I don't know if you know Ben Holliday. He's the head of design at the DWP. And he has been talking a lot about how to create culture and how to do service design. And here are some of his thoughts. Working in the open. Try, if you can, to avoid the secrets and the politics. Sharing, not sending. Just put it out there. I'm sure some of you are already doing this. You've mentioned that you have blogs. Right people, same room. So bringing people together. That's very hard in my current job in India. Less process, more progress. As I mentioned, try to get away from that. Don't wait for permission. Again, very un-British thing to just be the rebel and get on with it. Very Dutch thing, by the way. Just get on with it. So, showing the thing. Has anybody heard this? Stop having meetings about an idea. Always, 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 always have an artifact or a thing in hand, even if it's the dumbest, crappiest sketch you can manage. Because that avoids these sort of weird conceptual meetings where you all talking about something but all have different ideas in your head. People, not resources. Get away from that idea as fast as possible. Building strong communities. So an interesting culture change technique I've heard about is just building informal meetup groups, like it might be a design-centric one, particularly if your institution's larger. Just put a flag in the sand and say, right, once every month, I'm going to do an hour where people can come and just talk about the challenges they face in design or content or whatever it is. Start building those bridges. And the Silicon Valley way, fail fast and learn. But there's a weird thing about culture, which we've been talking about a lot at Clear Left, which is it's kind of like Inception, right? In that it cannot be imposed. People need to have these ideas on their own. I'm sure you're going to have honest conversations with your stakeholders about why they should not be the one to decide whether your work is good enough anymore. They are not the people that decide. Sorry, they're not. Users, that's who decides. But they have to come to these conclusions themselves. You have to kind of be able to plant the seeds in their heads and get them talking about these things. It cannot be imposed. I mean, much as I'd love to be, encouraging a council to hire a head of design, which, I could see that happening soon, to start imposing some of that top-down stuff. It kind of needs to come from them. And it also takes a lot of vulnerability to talk about behavior. Like, imagine speaking to one of your superiors and saying, that way that you decide on the quality of something is no longer appropriate in this era. How do you have that conversation? That's hard, right? Really hard. But I have one tool for you. Marshall Rosenberg's Nonviolent Communication. If you read this, it's a super hippie book. Like, it's properly, like, it has a Deepak Chopra thing on the bottom, like, which just makes me run a mile. But this is one of the most life-changing things I've ever read. It made me really think about my relationships. And just to translate it into tech terms, it's kind of like an API for good human relations. So I highly recommend this. If you want to figure out how I'm going to be safe and be vulnerable in front of somebody, this is a really good starting point. So I know we're slightly out of time here, running late, but I want to tell you a story about somebody who's very well known, who I shall not name, who I had lunch with once, who talked at the table for an hour. Didn't ask any questions, wasn't curious, he just talked and talked and talked. And about 3/4 of the way through this lunch, he drops this. He says, "Oh, you know, Steve called me up and hired me to be, you know, head of design over there. But, you know, I didn't want to work at Apple because why be an angel amongst the angels?" I won't tell you where he ended up, but it was not a design-centered organization. But it blew my mind, right? Like, it was an epic brag. It was a crazy brag, but at the same time, it was fantastic. Like, he chose not to work with the organization where he would fit the most as a head of design. He understood that institutions that are struggling, those are the places where they need the help to shift their culture and their mindset the most. So I want you to think about that quote if you're ever feeling really down about the way your institution treats your profession, is that maybe they need your help more than other places do. There's always a limit, right? You've always reached the end of your rope, but think about that. I think about it a lot. But the other thing about that story is I have this personal fear of becoming somebody who never listens. Like, if I continue on the speaking circuit, right? Like, I'll be that person that everybody looks to for wisdom. And I'm sort of like, is that what you turn into? Somebody who just talks at people for an hour? And they're a leader? I really hope I'm not one of those people when I'm older. And there's a specific reason for this. Project Aristotle. So Google decided to figure out what makes teams great internally at Google. And they looked at IQ, they looked at everything. They looked at code deployment, IQ, a whole bunch of measures on what makes a great team. And here are the findings. They create a sense of psychological safety. Everyone is free to challenge. Everyone. There's equality in distribution of turn-taking. So if you want something that needs intervening is when there is somebody who speaks too much in your team or in meetings. It is absolutely fundamental to high-functioning teams that voices don't take over. I'll give you a method to deal with that. I use something called the KJ method to make decisions. If you want a tip on how to stop those voices taking over, that's the one I have. Informality. Again, I know some of you are probably from institutions which are highly formal. You have these people who've worked their way up the ranks. They, dress in a very particular way. They expect to be impressed when you walk in the room. You need to start fighting that culture. It doesn't help you. And the other thing is that they have emotional stability when things are hard. That's the real telltale sign that, for example, their leaders don't freak out and start shouting at people. And I'll give you 2 reasons why this is so important. It saves lives. Do you know what the most accident-prone airline in the world is? Korean Airlines. Do you know why? Because they're so hierarchical that even in the moments when the plane is about to crash, and they've captured these moments on tape from the black box recorders, the co-pilots are not free to challenge the pilot. And now they are all being retrained in Western culture about how to change the authority. It's really weird, right? It's not about the controls, not about the design. It's about their culture. This is also the thing that sank Nokia, because none of the middle managers, when the smartphone era truly arrived and the iPhone was invented, none of the middle managers were free to tell the top leaders at Nokia what was really happening in the marketplace. They lied. They hid. They sunk the company because they weren't allowed to have an honest conversation. And that's what I'm going to leave you with. Thanks very much.